Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Scott Greenwald, and I'll be presenting on facial recognition algorithms using a face extraction feature as well as the EigenFace detection feature. To begin with, why is face detection and face recognition important? We'll begin with the military. Being able to distinguish between certain individuals could mean the difference between life and death for a civilian or for the target of interest. For example, being able to locate specific individuals and identify who they are will drastically improve the ability to carry out a mission. When looking for surveillance through reconnaissance and investigations, being able to detect who an individual is and who they are not is drastically important. But it also goes down to the civilian level as well. For example, imagine if someone robbed a bank and they were running around New York City. Well, on every street corner, there are cameras. So being able to detect where the faces are within every frame of a video and who the faces are will allow the police department to be able to determine where the suspect is for that given instance. So being able to detect who and where an individual is greatly important in our everyday lives. So for this research, there are two different branches that I will discuss today. Face extraction from an image, and then facial recognition from that image as well. So to begin with, facial extraction. For this research, I used a Viola Jones algorithm in order to locate where the face or faces are within an image. And it does this by looking for different features on every face, for example, the eyes, the nose, the chin, etc. This algorithm works using kernels and a sliding window approach. For example, it might start in the top left corner of an image, having a kernel size of a given range. They are all various ranges for every different filter. And essentially, it'll determine whether or not that kernel is a suspect image for a face. If it is, then it'll continue on with the algorithm. If it's not, it'll slide on to the next kernel. And it does this using HAR-like filters, which I'll give some examples in some further slides as well. But the Viola Jones algorithm, due to the structure of the algorithm, is very successful and has a very low false positive rate, and also is very fast at processing, which I'll explain why in the future. So to begin with, this is one example of a HAR-like filter that determines where the eyes are in a face. So basically, a HAR-like filter is a black and a white rectangular filter, and there's different variations of size and number of rectangles in the filters themselves that basically look for the natural shadows within a face. So in any given face, your eyes are pressed back behind the bridge of your nose, causing a shadow directly beneath your eyes and around them. So for this specific HAR-like filter, the black rectangle will technically look for where the eyes are and where those darker shadows are, and then directly beneath it, look to see if there's a brighter aspect, which would be why the face is further pushed forward to look for the eyes. And if this filter is passed, then it'll go on to the next HAR-like filter to determine, okay, was this a false positive or was it a true identification of where the eyes are within a face. So this is an example of pretty much all the HAR-like filters that are implemented in the Viola Jones algorithm. As you can see in the top left corners, we have the eye detection filters. The furthest corner image was the one that was on the previous slide. The image to its right is another eye detection filter that'll look horizontally on the face rather than vertically, and it'll follow essentially the same thought process. If the eyes are pressed back behind the nose and you're looking horizontally across an image, you should be able to detect a shadow or one eye, then move over to the middle of the face, which will be the nose, which should be brighter because it's pushed out closer towards the camera, and then once again move on to the second eye, which will be pressed back as well. So I won't go through all of these, but here's another example of technically some nose detection filters. And they follow on with the same thought process. As you can see in the upper right hand corner, the upper two rectangles are the same as the eye detection that we showed earlier. Now moving on to a nose detection, we then look to see basically directly below the nose, which is where your upper lip is. Once again, there's a little indent which will cause a natural shadow. So the way the Viola Jones algorithm will work is it might go through the first upper left corner filter, determine where the eyes are. If it passes, then it might move on to the upper right hand corner image that is circled right now and add on the extra black har filter to determine, okay, well, is that a nose? If it fails the eye detection, it won't move on to the nose detection because it already has excluded this portion of the image as a face. So how does the Viola-Jones algorithm work? It's actually fairly simple. All it does is essentially sums up all the pixel intensities within the white rectangles and subtracts that from all the pixel intensities from the black rectangles. And if the output of this formula exceeds a certain threshold, then that filter is flagged as a potential candidate for a face, and the next har filter will be implemented to determine was it a false positive or was it true. This algorithm is extremely efficient because it also knows that in comparison to the number of pixels within an image, the number of faces is going to be drastically smaller. So given a 100 by 100 pixel image, there may be a couple faces at most. So it drives the false positive rate way down in order to maximize the efficiency of the algorithm itself. So when running this through the MATLAB simulation that I'll show an example and demonstration of later on in the presentation, I had a roughly 600 image database that I ran through the Viola-Jones algorithm to determine how long does it take to process. And as you can see, it takes roughly on average about a third of a second to locate where the faces are within the image, determine how many faces there are actually in the image, and then give out the results of the location. So it's extremely fast, can be used for any situation real time as well. So this is just an example of the Viola-Jones algorithm. Basically, I sent this image into the algorithm itself and output all the different locations of the faces, and I just drew a rectangle around each output it showed. So out of about the 30 images or 30 faces within this image, almost all of them are actually spotted, except for the ones at the top of the image where a lot of the face was either cut off or covered by another person's head. So as you can see, it's a very successful algorithm. However, there are some false detections, of course, just as in any automated pattern recognition algorithm. Out of the 600 images that I threw into the database, you can see there were a couple that had two faces within the image. There was one that had three. All of the images that were in this database had a single image, such as this one that was used actually as a suspect for a facial recognition algorithm. So in the previous graph, the few that had a couple extra detections that were false positives, it was similar to this image where you could see there was an extra detection on this woman's neck. Probably has to do with an extra shadow from the chin itself coming down onto the neck due to the lighting of the room. But based on the previous slide, you can see that the false detection rate is well below 1%, which is great for an automated process. So once we actually have the face extracted from the image, we then run into the facial recognition portion of this project and calculating eigenvectors for every face, or eigenfaces in this instance. So I'll go through and explain each step in calculating the eigenvectors, and then how we go about recognizing an input image in comparison to all of the images within a database. So the first step is to convert a 2D image into a one-dimensional array and concatenate all the images into a two-dimensional matrix. So to give an example, if we had a 100 by 100 pixel image, for example, we'd convert that to a 1 by 10,000 pixel image array, and then we would combine every one of those arrays into the same two-dimensional matrix so that we contain however many images in our database in a single two-dimensional matrix rather than a three-dimensional matrix, which will improve the processing speed. We then will create the average face vector for the entire database itself. Essentially, take the average of every pixel at that pixel location, and then determine what the face looks like. We will then go through and calculate the difference images, which will be the original one-dimensional vector subtracted by the average face vector. And the reason we do this is to help bring out the features within the face. Because the average face vector is going to be very blurry due to the shapes and different shapes of the nose and the chin and eyes of every individual, subtracting out the low frequency of every image will help bring out the higher frequencies within the actual image and face itself. So after we have the difference images, then we actually can go ahead and start calculating our eigenvectors. We do this by calculating the covariance, and there's two different ways of doing this. One, we can take the difference images and multiply that by the transpose of the difference images, where A is the difference image, or we can take the transpose of the difference and multiply it by the difference. Now the reason I have both of these here is because they produce drastically different results. For the first example, where we do A times A transpose, that'll produce an n squared by n squared matrix, where n is the number of pixels in an image. So for the example I was stating earlier, the covariance would output 100,000 by 100,000 matrix, while the one on the right will produce the number of images in a database by that same number. So for the example where I was showing you with the Viola Jones, where I had roughly 600 images, that would produce a 600 by 600 image as compared to a 100,000 by 100,000 image. For my computer itself, I actually can't even handle the first process because it runs out of memory too quickly. That's why this process is not practical. It's not speed efficient if a computer is able to handle it. However, the second covariance equation is very quick and operates in milliseconds because it's a very small matrix itself. We then have to calculate the weights for the eigenvector in order to determine what vectors within that 600 by 600 matrix are the best and should we use in order to compare to an input image. And we do this by essentially taking the transpose of the eigenvectors and multiplying them out by the difference images, and we essentially come out with our weight vectors. Now for steps 1 through 5, this completes the database process itself. We can save off this database, and any input image that we bring in order to recognize the face will operate on steps 1 through 5. We then will go through and I'll look at the minimum weighted eigenvectors for each face in the database and compare that to the eigenvector for the input image, as seen in step 6. And if any error is below a threshold that I choose, we count that as a detection, and that face will be recognized. If anything is exceeding that threshold, then it'll be a new image, and we can add that to the database for future processing. Now for the eigenvector approach itself, the threshold value is determined heuristically, which means essentially trial by error. Basically, how I implemented the threshold was I threw in a bunch of images, both that should have been detected and should not have been detected, based on who was in the database I was looking at, and did a trade study essentially of what threshold values would increase the number of correct detections but decrease the false positives as well. For this research as well, I wanted to use all test subjects that were in a lab, that way I had roughly the same background and lighting. This is very important for an eigenvector approach because it's heavily dependent on these aspects, as well as any other facial recognition algorithms. One other thing that's very important is also getting different aspects of the face, whether it's directly onto the camera or at a 90-degree angle. This will increase the likelihood of finding any image that has a slight offset in faces. So for this research, I decided to use the National Cheng Kung University's database of roughly 6,000 images, and each individual had roughly 20 images of different facial aspects as well. And I'll show you what some of the images look like further on in the live demonstration in the presentation. But to give you an idea of what some of the outputs from the eigenvector look like, I've put together a bunch of different images that were used on the 600 image database that I was referring to earlier. The reason I did that instead of using the 6,000 one is because as you increase the number of images in a database, things become a lot more blurred out, and you can't determine what you're actually looking at. So I wanted to give a better understanding of what we're actually calculating during the eigenvector approach. So to begin with, this is the average face vector. As you can see, it's very blurred out, but we're able to easily distinguish where the eyes, the nose, and the mouth are. When we start getting to the borders of the head and where hair is, that's where things really start to get ghosty and blurred out, because everyone has different hairstyles, while the features of the face are typically in the same locations. We then would take this average face vector and subtract it from the actual image itself, which is on the left. So on the right, we have our difference images, and you can tell based on the intensity of the pixel values, the higher the intensity, the brighter the pixel. The features of the face are actually brought out more. The nose and the edges of the nose and the lips and the eyes are all higher intensities, while the forehead and the cheek area, which are more broad and more comparable to other images, are darker, which helps bring out where the features are for the calculations of the EigenFace itself. Then, calculating the EigenFace, or ghost image as it's called in this algorithm as well, we can produce the eigenvector and the best eigenvector for this individual. Now, it's called a ghost image because it actually doesn't resemble him much, and it's a very weird looking image, but this is actually what the eigenvector looks like itself. So going along with processing speed, because that's something that's very important in facial recognition algorithm as well as in this research, and going in comparison to the Viola-Jones portion of the algorithm, you can see with a roughly 600 image database, it takes about 2 to 2.5 seconds in order to calculate the eigenvectors, the best vectors, and then the weights for all 600 images, which is pretty efficient. However, when you increase the image count by a factor of 10 to 6,000, we see that it actually increases up to closer to 2 minutes. So it's obviously heavily dependent on how many images are in the database. While for the Viola-Jones algorithm, it doesn't really matter because you're processing things on an individual image itself, rather than a collection of images to produce a database in this case. So in conclusion, the Viola-Jones algorithm has been a very efficient algorithm. It has very small false detections, with having a very high success rate, as seen in the images before, where there were 30 images or 30 faces within the picture, and all 30 essentially were found. However, for the eigenvector approach for the face recognition portion of this research, it isn't as efficient. It's extremely dependent on the lighting, background, and face angles of every image in the database. For example, if you don't have a database of controlled images, which is what I was using originally, just taking pictures in my my apartment outside, trying to get a variety of image backgrounds, it is impossible in order to detect exactly who the person is because of the variations in the backgrounds. Also, the eigenvector approach has one very large issue with it, in my opinion, in calculating the threshold values themselves. Because the threshold values are determined heuristically, as explained earlier, every database will need a different threshold value. As you increase the number of images within the database, the threshold value will actually decrease in order to match the number of possible detections within the database. So for this, I think for future research, it would be very useful and important to determine a way to calculate the threshold dynamically, and be able to basically say, how are we going to look at this database and compare this image to one threshold while a different image to another threshold in order to maximize the number of detections. Going in the future, I think this is the way to go for this approach, and I think it would greatly increase the probability of recognition of a face. So that concludes the actual presentation portion of this project. Now I'll give a live demonstration of the software that I built in MATLAB to implement the Viola-Jones and the eigenvector approach. So I'll show two different examples, one with a very small database to show how I train the actual software itself, and then I already have another one loaded with the 6,000 image database loaded. So I will run the facial recognition algorithm, and this is the GUI that I've produced. Now I have a few different options. I can either train the system with a whole new database, or I can load in a database that I've already calculated all of the eigenvectors for and go straight into the recognition approach. So I'll start off, I'll check off the Viola Jones face extraction, which is what I want, and I'll hit the training button. And all I have to do is locate what folder I want to use for the actual training, and it'll import in all of the images in that folder, calculate the vectors, calculate the weights, and everything I need, as well as the Viola Jones extraction. So first off, it'll locate the folder, find out how many images are in it. It'll import in the image and automatically do the Viola Jones algorithm and crop out any background in the image itself. So I only have the face, and I'll enter in the name of the individual as well. I'll just start numbering them. Now, in the instance of having multiple images or multiple faces within the image, the user has the opportunity to select an image. Now, for the research that I'll show with the 6,000 images, there was only one face, but I wanted to add this feature in case there were false detections. I could choose to make sure I had the face itself and not the false detection portion. So I'll just click on this person and I'll throw in a name for each person. And as you can see, the Viola Jones algorithm is actually implementing. As soon as I hit OK, this image is loaded into my database, and the next image is loaded. The Viola Jones is implementing and popped up. So it's very quick and efficient to get to the next image as well. As soon as I hit done, for this example, there were only 5 images in that folder. The average vector face is shown immediately. Now for this one, it's obviously very different because the faces were all in different orientations and there's a very small sample. Naturally, as you increase the number of images, the average face vector, as seen in the PowerPoint itself, becomes more distinct and you can actually see the features. And then I have the opportunity to save the database off right here for future processing, so I don't have to actually train the system every single time. So this is how the database actually works. Now I'll close this one out and I'll load in the database with the roughly 6,000 images that I was discussing earlier. And as you can see, this is the average database image. Because there are so many pictures and slight variations in each picture, you actually can't distinguish who the person is or what the actual image is, which is why I wanted to show a different image in the PowerPoint itself. So now that the database is already loaded, all of my eigenvectors, all my weights are calculated. I can then start with the recognition process. So I'll go in, I'll load an image, and say I load in this person, for example, who is in the database itself, but not this image at a different orientation. And I open it, and I'll get just a dialog box asking if I want to rotate the image, because I was having some issues sometimes where images were vertical and not horizontal. So I'll put 0 because it's already at the correct orientation. And as soon as I hit OK, the eigenvectors will be calculated for this individual and then compared to every individual in the database. And if any of them break the threshold, then it'll be a detect. So as soon as I hit OK, all of that is calculated immediately. As you can see, it's very fast. We found his match, or one of the matches within the database of who he is at a different orientation. And it'll show who the actual individual is. I just put numbers down for every individual, but in a real world situation, you put the name naturally of the person and how much of a match it was. So it was a perfect match for him. Now, for example, if I load an image of myself who is not in the database and I hit OK, naturally no match is found, which is the correct answer. It shouldn't. Now I'm able to, as soon as I hit the add to database button, the value right here with the number of images will increase by 1, and a new eigenvector, new average face, will be calculated for every individual in the image, or in the database as well. So as soon as I hit add to database, it'll take, as I said in the PowerPoint, a couple minutes to process. So I'll pause the recorder and start it back up once it's updated, and I can continue on with the live demonstration as well. So I'll throw in the name of what I want to name this individual and hit OK. And now I will pause the recorder. Okay, so after a couple minutes, the database was updated as stated down here, and the image of myself was added to the database as this number has increased by 1. To just give one more example, I will then load in another image. Computer's running a little slow. But I'll load in another image, same situation as before, where this individual is in the database himself, but this image is not. It's just at a different aspect angle. So I'll open it up, and it'll prompt me to rotate the image if I would like, which I'll decline because it's already at the correct orientation. Again, as soon as I hit OK, it'll calculate the EigenFace for this individual, compare it to the entire 5,891 images, and see if he's in the database himself. So as soon as I click OK, it'll run that process, and the match was found. Once again, it shows who the individual was and the percentage. So this concludes the live demonstration of the facial recognition and face extraction software. If there are any questions, feel free to send me a message as well.